Have you ever noticed how loud the world has become? Not just the traffic outside your window, the endless buzz of notifications on your phone, or the clatter of conversations in crowded rooms, but something deeper, something far more relentless. A noise that never stops. It's the noise inside your head. That endless stream of thoughts, doubts, worries, memories you didn't ask for, and plans for a future you can't control. It starts the moment you wake up. What time is it? Did I sleep enough? What's on my to-do list? I forgot to call mom. I hope they liked what I posted. Why did she say that yesterday? What if I'm not good enough? One thought after another. Tick, tick, tick. We live in a world obsessed with productivity, with noise, with constant connection. But here's the paradox no one talks about: the more connected we are, the more disconnected we feel. And it isn't the world outside causing the most damage. It's the storm inside. You see, ancient wisdom understood this long before the age of smartphones. The great Buddhist masters spoke of the monkey mind, a mind that leaps from one branch of thought to another, never resting, never still. But what if there was a way to quiet it? Not by running away to a mountain cave, not by turning off your phone forever, but right here, in the middle of the chaos. What if silence isn't the absence of sound, but the absence of unnecessary thought? A kind of stillness you can carry within you, whether you're stuck in traffic, sitting in a meeting, or lying awake at night. There's a reason so many of us feel exhausted even after 8 hours of sleep. It's not our bodies that are tired. It's our minds, constantly rehearsing conversations we'll never have, worrying about things that will never happen, reliving moments we can't change. It's like living next to a radio you can't turn off. And over time, that invisible noise drowns out the most important things: peace, presence, joy, wisdom. We start reacting to life instead of experiencing it. We forget what it means to truly be here. But silence, true inner silence, is still possible, not by force, not by suppression, but by understanding the nature of the mind, by learning how to sit with the noise without being controlled by it. Buddhist philosophy doesn't ask you to erase thoughts. It teaches you to see them for what they are: passing clouds in an endless sky. Because beneath all that mental static is a vast, unshaken stillness. Imagine for a moment an ocean. On the surface, waves crash and foam, storms rage, tides rise and fall. But the deeper you go, the calmer it becomes. At the very bottom, it's completely still. Your mind is just like that. Most people live their whole lives at the surface, tossed around by every wave. But those who learn to dive deeper discover a peace that the world can't touch. And here's the beautiful secret: that peace has always been there. You just forgot how to notice it, because nobody taught you how. Nobody explained that the real source of stress, anxiety, and restlessness isn't out there. It's in here. And the solution isn't another app, another drink, another vacation, or a new set of goals. It's silence. Not silence for its own sake. Not a cold, empty void, but a living, breathing, vibrant silence. The kind that reveals what's underneath the noise. The kind that lets you finally hear yourself again. The kind that makes life feel like it's yours. So before you scroll to the next video, before your mind pulls you back to your to-do list, pause. Notice the noise inside right now. That restless hum of thought. Can you feel it? And now notice the space between this sentence and the next. There, that was it. A glimpse. A spark of the silence that's always waiting beneath the waves. In the chapters ahead, we'll explore how to find it more often, how to recognize it amidst chaos, and how to let it become the unshaken center of your life. But for now, just remember this: you are not the noise. You are the one who hears it, and in that knowing, there's freedom. Did you feel it, that tiny space? That brief, perfect silence at the end of the last chapter. It was small, maybe just a heartbeat, but in that moment you were no longer lost in thought. You were aware. And that awareness, that noticing, is the key to everything. You see, most people live their entire lives like leaves blown by the wind, tossed around by moods, memories, and endless to-do lists. They believe that whatever thought passes through their mind is them, that every feeling is real, that every craving, every fear, every judgment is the truth. But it is. The ancient teachings of Buddhism offer us a radically different understanding. Your mind is not you, it's a tool, a servant, a landscape through which thoughts pass like weather over an open sky. Think of it like an ocean. On the surface there are waves, sometimes calm, sometimes violent, joy, anger, worry, hope, desire. But those waves are not the ocean itself. Beneath the surface, deeper and deeper, the water grows still, silent, endless, and it's in that deep, unmoving space that your true self exists. Not the identity made of names, job titles, Instagram bios, or the stories you tell yourself, but the witness, the awareness that has been silently watching your life unfold since the very first moment you opened your eyes. This is what the old masters called the unshaken mind, a mind untouched by the chaos of the world, not because life stops being difficult, but because you stop mistaking the surface for the depth. You see, suffering doesn't come from what happens to us. It comes from our reaction to what happens, and our reactions are born from the restless waves of the untrained mind. A thought appears, we believe it. A feeling rises, we cling to it. A desire emerges, we chase it. A fear creeps in, we run from it. And so we spend our lives in a storm that was never ours to begin with. But when you learn to see the mind for what it is, a constantly moving surface above a vast, silent depth, everything changes. You begin to notice that thoughts are just thoughts. They come, they go, they rise, they fall. None of them are permanent, none of them define you, the Buddha once said. Just as a skilled fisherman watches the ripples on the water and knows the fish beneath, so does the wise one watch the movements of the mind and know its nature. And here's the beautiful truth. The mind isn't your enemy. It's not something you need to fight. It's a wild river, sometimes calm, sometimes raging, but always moving. And your job isn't to dam it up or force it still. Your job is to sit by the bank, watch it flow, and realize you are not the water. This is the practice, not to stop thinking, but to stop identifying. To notice a thought as it appears, to let it pass without clinging, and to rest again in that silent awareness underneath. It sounds simple, and it is, but it's also the hardest thing in the world, because we've been conditioned since the moment we could think to believe that we are our thoughts. But think about it. You've had thoughts you disagreed with. You've had feelings that changed. You've made judgments you later regretted. If you were those things, how could you notice them? The fact that you can observe your thoughts means you are something deeper, the observer, the witness, the clear sky behind the clouds. And this, my friend, is the ocean within you, a space so vast, so untouched by the chaos of the world that once you taste it, you'll never again believe you're just the waves. Imagine carrying that kind of calm with you, in the middle of traffic, during an argument, while standing in a crowded room, not escaping from life but standing inside it, anchored in stillness. This isn't a fantasy, it's a practice. And every person, no matter how restless their mind, can learn to find it. Because here's the most liberating truth you'll ever hear. You don't have to control the waves to find peace. You just have to stop getting pulled under. In the next breath, in the next moment, you can step back, notice the mind, and let it be. And in doing so, you'll discover a silence that was always waiting for you beneath the noise. And if you listen closely, you can already hear it calling. Close your eyes for a moment. Can you hear it? Not the sound of traffic, not the fan in the corner, not the distant murmur of life outside your window. I mean the space between sounds, that subtle hum underneath everything. A presence so constant, so eternal, we forget it's even there. The ancient yogis had a name for it. They called it nada, the primal sound of the universe, and the practice of listening to it is known as nada yoga. But let's be clear, this isn't about music. It's not a melody or a song. Nada yoga is the art of listening beyond noise, of tuning your awareness to the hum of silence itself. Because here's the paradox no one tells you. Silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of something deeper, a soundless sound, a vibration that holds every other sound within it. And if you can learn to listen, truly listen, to that subtle resonance, it will pull you beneath the surface of your restless mind and carry you into the deepest stillness you've ever known. Think of it like this. When you walk into a room filled with chatter, your attention darts from one voice to another. Words, laughter, footsteps. But underneath it all, there's a space, a presence, a hum. It was there before anyone spoke. It will be there after they leave. And it's there inside you too. In the teachings of Nada Yoga, it's believed that all creation began with sound. Not a bang, not a flash, but a tone, a cosmic vibration known as Om. Not just a word, but a living frequency, the heartbeat of existence itself. And this sound isn't confined to temples or chants. It's vibrating inside you right now, in the pulse of your blood, in the echo of your breath, in the electric shimmer of your thoughts. And when you grow quiet enough, you can hear it. At first it feels like nothing, an emptiness, but stay a little longer, and you'll notice a faint ringing, a gentle hum. A sound so subtle it could be mistaken for silence. And that right there is where the door opens. The Buddha spoke of it too. Though he used different words, he pointed to the same truth. Within the stillness of the heart, there arises a knowing beyond words. This knowing isn't something you learn. It's something you remember, because you've always known it. As a child lying awake at night, as a wanderer watching the stars, as a soul standing by the ocean, feeling the immensity of existence stretch out forever. It was there then. It's here now. Nada Yoga isn't about escape. It's not about running from the noise of the world. It's about listening so deeply, so completely, that the noise dissolves. Not because it stops, but because it's no longer louder than the silence within. And this isn't philosophy, it's practice. You don't need a cave. You don't need a monastery. You only need this moment, this breath, this body. Right now, wherever you are, let your awareness settle. Listen. Notice the sounds around you. No need to judge them, name them, or push them away. Just let them be, and then listen beyond them, to the hum, the ringing, the presence, and you'll realize it's been there all along. A constant, steady tone beneath the clatter of your thoughts. Some call it nada, some call it God. Some call it awareness. The name doesn't matter. What matters is that it's yours, it belongs to you, and no one can take it away. When you start to hear it, even for a moment, you begin to understand. Silence isn't empty. It's full of everything you've been searching for, and from this space, life looks different. Anger softens, desire loosens its grip, fear fades, because you realize for the first time that the noise was never the problem. The problem was that you forgot how to listen. And so, in the middle of your busy, beautiful, messy, miraculous life, you begin to hear the hum beneath it all. And that hum says one thing: you are home. What if I told you? The noise isn't out there. It's not the cars, the voices, the notifications, the endless scroll of headlines. The real noise lives inside you. Every thought, every memory, every unspoken fear, every ancient longing. It's an orchestra playing without a conductor, and most of us have never learned how to sit in its audience. But there's a path, a way to meet the storm within, not by silencing it, but by witnessing it. The ancient yogic masters called it Antar Mouna, inner silence, not as the absence of thought, but as a space where you no longer cling to them. A profound practice of stepping back from the mind's endless chatter and remembering the quiet, expansive awareness that was there before thought ever existed. And this isn't a mystical idea. It's a practical method, a journey through 5 stages, each one peeling back a layer of the mind's noise until only clarity remains. Stage 1. Awareness of external sounds. You begin where you are, in the middle of your ordinary world. The first step isn't to shut out the world, but to notice it. The ticking clock, the distant voices, the hum of a passing car, not to judge, not to name, but simply to hear. Because when you truly listen without resistance, external noise begins to lose its grip on you. It's no longer an enemy, it just is. And in that moment you realize, Silence doesn't mean the world stops. It means you stop clinging to it. Stage 2. Awareness of the inner soundscape. Once you've made peace with the world's sounds, you turn inward. And what you find there is startling. A constant stream of thoughts, words, images. Stories you didn't even know you were telling yourself. Regrets from yesterday. Plans for tomorrow. The way someone looked at you. The ancient ache you've carried for years. This is your internal soundscape. And in Antar Mouna, you don't fight it. You don't chase it away. You watch, like clouds drifting across a vast sky. Each thought appears, and each thought dissolves. And in that watching, something miraculous happens. You begin to realize you are not your thoughts. You are the one observing them. Stage 3. Conscious creation of thoughts. Once you've learned to witness the natural current of your mind, you take the reins not to control, but to understand. You deliberately call forth thoughts, a memory, a desire, a fear, and you watch how it arises, how it moves, how it fades. Why? Because when you create a thought consciously, you realize all thoughts, even the ones that haunt you, are just visitors, not permanent, not you. It's like learning the secret of a magic trick. What once held power over you begins to dissolve. Stage 4. Conscious erasure of thoughts. Now you take one more step. When a thought arises, you don't feed it, you let it pass. Not by force, not by anger, but by gentle indifference. A thought of anger appears, you see it, and like a wave it crests and falls. A desire surfaces, you don't deny it, you watch, and it fades. It's in this stage you discover something quietly astonishing. The mind's noise exists only because you believe in it. Stop clinging and it stops controlling. Stage 5. The silent witness. And finally, the deepest stage. The thoughts grow faint, the noise softens, and what remains is the one who was watching all along, the silent witness. This awareness isn't something you create, it's what's always been there, watching your childhood, watching your heartbreak, watching your victories, never touched, never broken, never absent. The Upanishads spoke of it as smaller than the smallest, greater than the greatest, closer than your own breath, yet farther than the farthest star. And here in this silent witnessing, you touch a truth older than words. You are not your thoughts. You are not your emotions. You are not your story. You are the vast, silent space within which it all happens. In Antar Mouna, you don't escape the mind. You learn to live beside it, to watch it like the wind in the trees. And when you do, something beautiful unfolds. Life slows, the noise softens, and you realize there was never anything missing. Just a hum beneath it all, calling you home. And as we journey deeper into this landscape of silence, we'll soon face a deeper truth. The thing we most fear about stillness isn't silence, it's the loss of control. But that is a story for another time. Imagine for a moment what it would be like to sit down and do absolutely nothing. No goals, no expectations, no mantras, no techniques, no attempt to calm the mind or chase away thoughts. You just sit. Simple, yes. Easy. Not at all, because in a world addicted to doing, the most radical act is to simply be. The ancient Zen masters had a name for this, Shikantaza. It means just sitting. Not meditating in the way most of us imagine, trying to empty the mind or chase a particular state of peace, but sitting in complete, open awareness, not as a technique, but as life itself, the practice of effortless effort. In Shikantaza, there's no object of meditation, no breath to follow, no image to hold, no thought to suppress. You sit, and you watch, noticing whatever arises, a memory, a physical sensation. The ache in your back, the distant sound of a bird, each thing appears and dissolves. You don't cling to it, you don't push it away. You don't label it good or bad. You remain, as the Zen poets would say, like a mirror, reflecting whatever appears without preference. This is the paradox of Shikantaza, effortless effort. You're fully awake, yet utterly ungrasping. You remain aware, yet don't try to control awareness. It's the art of sitting like a mountain, still, silent, and unconcerned by the clouds that drift across its peak. Why just sitting matters. You might wonder, what's the point of doing nothing? In a world obsessed with fixing, improving, healing, achieving, why waste time simply sitting? Because in that simplicity, you come face to face with the fundamental truth. You don't need to be anyone else. You don't need to arrive anywhere else. You don't need to improve this moment. It's already whole. It's already enough. But most of us never realize this because we're too busy trying to manufacture peace, instead of seeing that peace was never absent, facing the self without escape. What makes Shikantaza challenging isn't the sitting itself. It's what you meet when there's nothing left to distract you. In the absence of entertainment, ambition, and mental acrobatics, you encounter yourself, the unpolished self, the restless self, the frightened self, the part of you that you've built an entire life trying to avoid. And here's the wisdom the Zen masters discovered. When you stop running and simply sit, the monsters you fear shrink into shadows, the storms pass, and beneath it all, a vast quiet space remains. That's you, not the person you present to the world, not the anxious mind that doubts and desires, but the silent presence that watches it all. Beyond thought, beyond silence. And in time, you realize something even deeper. Shikantaza isn't about achieving silence, because thoughts will come, emotions will rise, discomfort will visit. The secret is you let them. And in that allowing, you notice that no matter what arises, there's a part of you untouched by it all. The mind moves, the world shifts, but awareness remains still. It's like sitting at the bottom of the ocean. Above you, currents flow, storms rage, ships pass. But down here, the water is calm, unmoving, timeless. And you begin to understand, peace doesn't come from silencing the mind. It comes from no longer believing you are the mind. The Zen spirit of no achievement. In Shikantaza, there's no trophy at the end, no badge of enlightenment, no peak experience to chase, because the very idea of achieving enlightenment only creates more distance. Zen is ruthless in its simplicity. It whispers, the thing you are seeking, you already are. But it can only be known when you stop trying to become. That's why the old masters would laugh at the idea of meditation as a path to something. To them, it wasn't a means to an end. It was life itself, just sitting, just breathing, just being. And in that radical simplicity, the profound is revealed, the echo of stillness. As you practice Shikantaza, something curious happens. Not during the sitting, perhaps, but afterward. The world feels softer, your reactions less sharp, the clamor of the mind less convincing. Because you've glimpsed the truth, you don't have to believe every thought. You don't have to chase every desire. You don't have to fix every flaw. You can just be. And in being, you discover a silence that was never missing, a peace so simple, so ordinary, that it escapes those too busy searching for it. And this is the heart of true meditation, not a struggle to quiet the mind, but a remembering of the quiet that was there before the mind spoke. As our journey continues, we'll explore how this silent awareness isn't an escape from life's struggles, but a way to meet them fully, courageously, compassionately. For what you discover in stillness is meant to be lived in motion, and that is the next doorway we'll quietly open together. There's a peculiar thing about the mind. It never seems to stop, thought after thought, like waves upon a restless shore. One arrives, then another and another, an endless tide of stories, memories, worries, plans. Most of us have lived so long inside this constant commentary that we take it as reality itself. But what if there's something hidden between those thoughts, a space so subtle, so fleeting, that it escapes the frantic grasp of a busy mind, and yet holds the key to a deeper, quieter truth? The ancient sages spoke of it, the Buddha hinted at it, the mystics named it the gap. Not a metaphor, a literal silence between the arising and passing of thoughts, and within that tiny pause, something timeless waits, where thoughts end and silence begins. Imagine this, you're sitting quietly, a thought appears, I need to check my phone. It lingers for a moment, then fades, and before the next thought takes its place, there's a flicker, a pause in absence. Most of us miss it, like blinking at the exact moment a shooting star crosses the night sky. But it's there, And in that brief, unclaimed instant, you're free, no identity, no past, no future, no worries, no name. Just pure, naked awareness, unfiltered, unconstructed, timeless. This is not some mystical exaggeration. It's the simple, direct experience that lies at the core of every genuine spiritual path. The silence between thoughts. The nature of the gap. You see, thoughts don't arrive as an unbroken stream. They come and they go. And between their coming and going, there is space. It might be small, a fraction of a second, a barely perceptible gap, but it's real. And the beauty is this: that space is what you are, not the thoughts, not the emotions, not the sensations they stir, but the silent awareness in which they rise and fall, the ocean between the waves, the sky behind the clouds, the vast, quiet canvas upon which the artwork of your life is painted. And every time you notice this gap, you're stepping out of the storm and into stillness. Why it's so easily missed. You might wonder if this silence is always here. Why don't we feel it more often? Because we're addicted to content. The mind craves stimulation the way the lungs crave air. A thought appears, we grab it. An emotion rises, we chase it. A sound stirs, we label it. We move so quickly from one thing to the next that the subtle silence between experiences goes unnoticed. It's not because it isn't there. It's because we don't linger long enough to feel it. But when you learn to slow down, to soften your gaze, to listen not just to the sound, but to the space between sounds, everything changes. Practicing the art of noticing. This isn't something you force. You don't grab the gap. You notice it, like glimpsing the shimmer of a fish beneath a still pond. In the quiet moments of your day, pause. Notice the end of an exhale before the next inhale begins. Notice the pause after a sentence, before the next word is spoken. Notice the tiny stillness after a sound fades, before another takes its place. These are the doorways, tiny cracks in the wall of constant mental chatter. And with each one you touch something ancient and vast. Why it matters. You might ask, what's the point of finding this space? Because in that gap, you realize something life-altering. You are not your thoughts. You are not the story you tell yourself, not the roles you play, not the fears you nurture in the dark. You are the awareness that notices it all. And when you begin to live from that awareness, a great untangling happens. Old patterns lose their grip. Reactive habits dissolve. A spacious kindness replaces self-judgment. You stop living at the mercy of your mind's storms and start resting in the calm beneath them, the presence between moments. And so it is with life. Between every heartbreak and joy, there is a pause. Between every ending and beginning, a stillness. We rarely notice these thresholds, but they shape everything. The space before you speak a word, the silence after a loss, the quiet anticipation before a lover's touch. These are the true sacred moments. And when you live aware of them, life takes on a different texture. Time softens, the heart opens, and a deep, unshakable presence begins to move through your days. Not a dramatic enlightenment, not fireworks in the mind, but a quiet, steady remembering of the silence you've carried within you all along. And so we continue. As we gently close this chapter, carry this awareness with you, not as an idea, not as a concept, but as a felt experience. Let the silence between thoughts become a doorway you revisit again and again. For in that sacred pause, life breathes differently, and the ancient wisdom whispers. The peace you seek was never lost. It was waiting, right here, right now, between this thought and the next. Somewhere along this quiet path, you may have begun to sense it, not as a thought, not as a theory, but as a presence, a silence that was never outside you, and never truly lost. It had simply been buried, beneath the endless commentary, the noise of a restless world, the expectations, the labels, the chasing, and now, having touched it, even for a moment, something within you remembers. The world as it is today moves faster than ever. More screens, more opinions, more distractions wrapped in urgency, every hour pulling us outward, demanding attention, reaction, allegiance. But what the world desperately needs, isn't more noise. It needs stillness. It needs people willing to step out of the storm and remember the ancient, unshakable quiet that lives beneath all of this. People like you, the power of one still mind. A single candle in a dark room can change everything. A still heart in a restless crowd becomes a refuge. One person, anchored in awareness, unmoved by the surface storms, can ripple calm through 1,000 unseen places, not through speeches, not through slogans, but by being, by walking through a loud world, with quiet feet, by listening when others shout, by pausing before reacting, by remembering that the silence between thoughts is not empty, but sacred. This is not an end, it's a return to what was never missing, a remembering of the home you carry within you. You don't need to become a monk. You don't need to abandon your life. You need only to pause, to notice, to listen, to find the space between this breath and the next, between this thought and the one to come. And in that tiny, unnoticed gap, everything changes, the silent revolution. If enough of us remember, if enough of us reclaim that ancient stillness, the world itself begins to shift, not through force, not through argument, but through quiet presence, a revolution of awareness, happening in living rooms, on sidewalks, in crowded subways, at silent dawns, a remembering that peace was never somewhere else, it was always within. And now you know where to find it. Stay connected to the silence. Before we part, I want to thank you for walking this path, for sitting in these quiet spaces, for trusting the voice of silence in a world addicted to noise. And if this journey spoke to something in you, if it stirred even a small remembering, I invite you to stay with us. This channel isn't just content, it's a refuge, a space for those who remember and those learning how. So take a moment, subscribe to this channel, turn on the bell, so the next time life feels heavy or your mind grows loud, you'll know exactly where to return, because here, the silence waits for you, and it always will.